The room held nothing but the sound of his own breathing. Character, one stood perfectly still, his weight balanced on the balls of his feet. In his right hand, a glass caught the thin sliver of light filtering through the blinds, casting a sharp, jagged reflection against the wall. He stared at it. His thumb traced the rim of the glass, back and forth, a rhythmic, mechanical motion that defied the absolute stillness of the air. Outside, the city hummed, but inside, the silence was absolute, heavy, and thick enough to feel against the skin. He did not blink. His eyes remained fixed on the liquid, watching the way it caught the light, watching the tiny imperfections in the glass distort the shadows behind it. He was waiting for something, or perhaps he was bracing for the moment he would finally let go. The clock on the wall did not tick. It only hummed a low, constant vibration that seemed to pull at the very foundation of the room. He shifted his grip, the glass clicking softly against the wood of the table. He was the only thing moving in the dark, and every breath he took seemed to echo against the floorboards, demanding an answer he was not yet ready to give. He set the glass down. It hit the wood with a sharp, hollow thud that seemed to wake the dust in the air. He turned his head slowly, scanning the corners of the room. This was the place. Years ago, he had sat in that corner chair, staring at the same floorboards until the dawn light forced his eyes shut. He remembered the cold sweat of that final night and the desperate, shaky resolve it took to pour the last of it down the drain. He walked to the center of the room, his boots clicking against the hardwood. He stopped exactly where he had stood the day he finally walked away from the life that nearly dismantled him. His gaze traveled to the windowsill, then back to the table. The irony was a physical weight. He had built everything he was on the foundation of this room, on the promise that he would never return to this specific square of floor. Now, he was back. He reached out and touched the edge of the table, feeling the grain of the wood under his fingertips. It was the same table, the same silence, and the same ghost of a man he thought he had left behind in the dark. The world outside saw a different man. They saw the survivor, the icon of resilience who had stared down his own destruction and emerged unscathed. Headlines had labeled him a hero, a testament to willpower, a man who had permanently conquered the shadows. He heard the echoes of those praises even now, rattling in the back of his mind. People stopped him on the street to thank him for his strength, as if his life were a blueprint for their own salvation. He paced the length of the room, his boots striking the floor with a rhythmic, heavy cadence. Every step felt like a lie. He looked at his own hands, steady and clean, and felt the immense pressure of that reputation pressing against his ribs. The public image was a polished statue, immovable and perfect. He was the man who stood tall, the man who never looked back, the man who had mastered his own fate. He stopped pacing and stared at the dark window, watching his own reflection. He saw the face the world knew, but he also saw the exhaustion hidden behind the eyes. He was tired of being the anchor for everyone else's hope. The hero they celebrated was a stranger, a construct built on a foundation he was no longer sure he could sustain. He held the glass between his thumb and index finger. It was cold, sweating moisture into his skin, the liquid inside swirling with every slight tremor of his hand. He looked down at the rim, watching the light catch the edge of the crystal. This was the threshold. For minutes, he had simply existed in the stillness, the weight of his own history pressing into the room. He felt the muscles in his forearm tighten as he gripped the glass firmer, the pressure turning his knuckles pale. He did not look up. He did not move his feet. He focused entirely on the distance between the bottom of the glass and the polished surface of the table. He took a breath, held it, and let his hand descend. The impact was deliberate, calculated, and final. The glass hit the wooden table with a sharp, ringing crack that echoed against the walls like a judge striking a gavel. The sound cut through the silence of the room, leaving no room for retraction. He released his grip, his fingers pulling away slowly, leaving the glass standing alone in the center of the wood. The act was finished. The testimony had begun. He stood motionless, his hands hanging at his sides, listening to the final vibration of the sound fade into the heavy air. The echo of the glass against the wood died away, leaving the room in a deeper, more suffocating silence. He did not turn toward the camera. He did not acknowledge the lens that had followed him for years. Instead, he shifted his weight and turned his back on the room, moving toward the dark window. Outside, the night was a void, turning the glass into a mirror. He stood close enough to see the pores of his skin, the gray in his stubble, and the hollows beneath his eyes. He leaned in, his palms resting flat against the cool frame of the window. His reflection stared back, distorted by the thin layer of glass and the shadows of the room behind him. He studied the face he had worn for the public, the mask of the man who had supposedly won his war. The light from a distant street lamp caught his eyes, making them appear sharp, almost accusatory. He parted his lips, but no sound came at first. He had to draw the air deep into his lungs to find the strength to speak. His voice was low, barely audible, vibrating against the glass. "Look at me," he whispered to the man in the reflection. It was the start of the unraveling. He began to speak, not to the world, but to the only person who knew the truth. The truth did not come as a sudden break, but as a slow, rhythmic wearing down of the stone. He kept his eyes locked on his own reflection, watching the subtle tightening of his jaw as the words began to take form. The sobriety he had built, the structure he had defended for so long, had fractured. It was an erosion, a gradual thinning of the lines he had drawn to protect himself. He spoke about the boundaries, describing them not as walls, but as fences he had allowed to fall into disrepair. He felt the weight of every word, the way they seemed to hang in the air between his lips and the window. There was no sharpness in his delivery, only the heavy, undeniable texture of fact. He moved his head slightly, watching the light shift across his face, highlighting the exhaustion he had tried to mask for months. The honesty was a physical burden. He could feel it in the way his shoulders slumped, in the way his hands stayed pressed against the window frame. He was stripping away the performance, layer by layer, until only the raw, fractured reality remained. He did not look away, even as the truth of his condition became impossible to ignore. He pushed away from the window, his heels clicking sharply against the hardwood floor. He walked to the center of the room and stopped by the heavy wooden table. He traced a circle in the dust on the surface with his index finger, staring at the mark. The first time was not a collapse. It was a Tuesday. He had been alone in a hotel room, the kind with thick curtains that kept the daylight out. He reached for the bottle out of boredom, a simple, calculated move to silence the persistent hum of his own thoughts. It was just one glass. He remembered the weight of the crystal in his hand, the way the amber liquid caught the dim light of the bedside lamp. He had told himself it was a singular event, a temporary departure from the rules he had set. There was no grand drama, no sudden crisis, just the quiet clink of glass against glass. He brought his hand up to his face, rubbing his thumb against his temple. That one instance had felt harmless, almost insignificant, but the memory of it now burned with the clarity of a mistake. He had opened a door he promised to keep locked, and in that moment, the boundary had simply ceased to exist. The isolation of that first hotel room did not last. The world demanded his presence, and he stepped back into the light of social gatherings. He stood by the wall in crowded rooms, his hand constantly occupied by a glass, his eyes scanning the crowd to ensure he was playing the part. It was a calculated performance. He would arrive, offer a polite smile, and navigate the room with the precision of a trained actor. The pressure to maintain the image of the man who had conquered his past was immense. He found that the glass in his hand served as a shield, a social prop that allowed him to blend into the noise. He recounted how he learned to hide behind the banter and the laughter, using the energy of the room to mask the growing disconnect. He adjusted his collar, his fingers tapping rhythmically against his neck. Every event was an exercise in endurance. He had to be the person they expected, the icon, the survivor. The facade required constant upkeep, and with every social engagement, the requirement to appear effortless became a heavier weight. He realized then that he was drinking not for the substance, but for the safety of the mask it provided. The social mask was only half the battle. The real erosion happened in the silence of his schedule. He spoke of the months that bled together, a relentless cycle of production meetings, travel, and the constant demand for peak performance. He paced the room, his boots heavy against the floorboards. He described the sensation of his own exhaustion, a thick, physical weight that settled behind his eyes by midday. The work was demanding, requiring a level of focus that left him frayed at the edges. He explained that by the time the day ended, the noise of the job did not stop. It echoed in his head, a constant hum of deadlines and expectations. He needed a pause button. He needed a way to cut the tension that vibrated through his nerves. He started using the bottle as a tool, a precise instrument to dull the sharp edges of his professional life. He would sit in his trailer or a quiet office, the script pages scattered across the table, and pour exactly enough to numb the pressure. It was not about pleasure. It was about survival, a way to force his mind to switch off so he could endure the next day. He stood still, his gaze fixed on the wall, showing the heavy toll of that daily, mechanical numbing. The professional pressure finally gave way to the silence of his own home. He described the nights that followed, those long stretches of darkness when the work stopped and the shadows grew heavy. He would unlock the front door, move through the hallway, and find himself in a house that felt too large. There were no scripts to read, no production meetings to attend, just the echo of his own footsteps on the floor. He spoke of the kitchen, the way he would sit at the small wooden table while the rest of the world slept. The old habits did not arrive with a bang. They returned as a quiet, familiar presence. He would reach for the glass, not because he was thirsty, but because the stillness of the house felt like a threat. He detailed the mechanics of those hours, the way he would stare at the clock, watching the minutes crawl toward dawn, the way he would tidy the room just to have something to do with his hands. Each glass was a way to fill the void of his own company. He paced the floor of the room now, demonstrating how he had paced those long, empty nights, turning the silence into a cage of his own making. He stopped pacing and stood perfectly still. His hands were clasped behind his back, his posture rigid. He looked at the glass on the table as if it were an exhibit in a trial. There were no apologies coming. He did not ask for understanding, and he did not seek to soften the edges of what he had done. He began to list the facts, his voice stripped of all inflection. He spoke of the frequency, the exact time of day he would reach for the bottle, and the specific triggers that prompted the reach. He dismantled the narrative of a victim, replacing it with the reality of a series of conscious, deliberate choices. Each sentence was a stone laid on a path he had built himself. He did not blame the pressure of the work or the isolation of his home. He laid out the timeline of his actions with the precision of a technician. He was not looking for forgiveness or a way to justify the return to his old life. He simply stated the sequence, stripping away the layers of pretense until only the raw, objective truth remained. He leaned forward, his eyes locked onto the glass, and continued his report with clinical detachment, presenting his own history like evidence submitted for review. The clinical tone held for a moment longer before it faltered. He stopped speaking, his jaw setting hard. It was not a sudden explosion of emotion, but a shift in his physical presence. His hand moved to his sternum, pressing against the center of his chest. He stood motionless, his gaze drifting from the glass to a fixed point on the wall. The realization was not a grand epiphany or a thunderclap of regret. It manifested as a dull, persistent ache behind his ribs, a physical weight that made every breath feel labored. He traced the sensation with his fingers, feeling the tension beneath his skin. This was the moment the logic of his choices finally collided with the reality of his situation. He realized then that the boundaries he thought he held had long since vanished. The silence in the room deepened, no longer just an absence of sound, but a heavy, suffocating pressure. He looked down at his own hands, steady but empty, and acknowledged the weight of his failure. It was a cold, hard fact. He had lost his grip, and the physical ache in his chest served as the only testament to that truth. He waited for the sensation to pass, his breathing shallow, his focus entirely on the quiet, hollow pain within. The heavy silence finally broke when he pushed off the wall. He did not remain stationary to process the ache. He moved. He took 3 sharp steps toward the window, pivoted, and crossed the room in a straight, aggressive line. His boot heel struck the hardwood with a rhythmic, percussive sound that filled the stagnant air. He paced the floor, his head down, shoulders locked in a rigid line. Every turn at the edge of the room was abrupt, a violent change in direction that matched the shifting thoughts behind his eyes. He walked with a frantic, focused energy, as if he could pace the truth into existence. He reached the corner, spun around, and paced back, his stride lengthening. He was not looking for a destination. He was burning off the static that had settled in his limbs. His movements were precise, devoid of hesitation, yet clearly driven by a mounting internal friction. He stopped suddenly, stared at the floorboards, then resumed his path, faster than before. The room seemed to shrink as he paced, the space between the walls narrowing with each pass. He was a man trapped by his own momentum, his body refusing to remain still while his mind replayed the sequence of his own undoing. Every step was a sharp, deliberate strike against the floor. He stopped mid-stride. The sudden stillness hit the room harder than the pacing had. He gripped the back of a wooden chair, his knuckles turning white against the polished grain. He looked up, his gaze locking onto the empty space where a listener would be. He did not blink. He did not soften his expression. He drew a long, slow breath, his chest expanding and falling with measured precision. "Do not mistake this for a plea," he said, his voice cutting through the silence like a blade. "I am not here for your pity. I am not looking for a soft place to land." He shook his head once, a sharp, dismissive motion. "I am here for the record. I am here to strip away the noise and lay the sequence bare. Every choice, every lapse, every moment I convinced myself I was still in control." He leaned forward, the chair creaking under his weight. His focus was absolute, his presence filling the room with a cold, hard clarity. "This is not a performance. It is a correction. I am setting the record straight, and I will not look away until every piece is in its place." He stood perfectly still, the intensity of his resolve vibrating in the quiet air. He started with the first departure. A single social glass, justified as a professional necessity to blend in. It was a lie he told himself with perfect conviction. Then came the frequency shift. 2 occasions turned into a weekly ritual, hidden behind the closed door of his private office. He traced the timeline with clinical precision, his voice devoid of inflection. He spoke of the nights when the work schedule became an excuse, a convenient shield to justify a drink that had nothing to do with the day's stress. He recounted the specific evening he stopped hiding the bottle, setting it on the desk in plain sight, convincing himself it was merely a prop for the image he projected to the world. Each admission felt like a physical blow to his own pride, his jaw tightening until the muscles stood out along his cheek. He detailed the erosion of his self-imposed rules, one boundary after another dissolving in the quiet. He didn't stutter. He didn't pause for sympathy. He marched through the sequence of his own choices, mapping the slow, steady slide from discipline into the familiar, suffocating grip of the old habit. He finished the list, his breath hitching once, a sharp, ragged sound that betrayed the calm facade he fought to maintain. He turned his head slowly, his eyes locked onto the glass sitting on the wooden table. It was half full, the amber liquid catching the low light of the room, casting a distorted glow against the dark grain of the furniture. He stared at it, not with hatred, but with a cold, piercing recognition. This was the boundary he had crossed, the physical manifestation of his surrender. He stepped toward the table, the floorboards groaning under his weight. He stopped inches from the edge. The silence in the room sharpened, pressing against his ears. He looked at the condensation trailing down the side of the glass, a single bead tracing a path through the dust. He did not reach for it. He simply stood there, his hands hanging limp at his sides, his chest rising and falling in a steady, rhythmic motion. The glass sat still, indifferent to his presence, yet it held the entire weight of his current reality. He leaned in, his face inches from the rim, his breath fogging the air around it. He was looking at the truth, stripped of every justification he had spent months crafting. It was there, tangible and unavoidable. He tightened his grip on the edge of the table until his knuckles turned pale, anchoring himself to the moment, refusing to blink as the reality of his choice stared back at him. He straightened his posture, pulling his focus away from the glass to address the empty room. His voice arrived, stripped of the cadence he used for the public, sounding raw and unvarnished. He spoke the final truth, the words hitting the walls with a hollow resonance. He admitted that the image of the man who conquered his demons was a shell, a hollow monument to a version of himself that no longer existed. He confessed that the descent was not an accident, but a series of calculated choices, each one designed to silence the internal noise he could no longer bear. He acknowledged that he had traded his integrity for the numbness of the bottle. The silence that followed his words felt heavier than before, thick with the weight of the confession. He did not look for redemption in the shadows. He stood exposed, the final truth echoing in the stale air of the room. He had dismantled his own legend, word by word, until nothing remained but the bare, uncomfortable reality of his current state. He let the final syllable hang, a jagged edge of honesty that cut through the comfort of his previous lies, leaving the room vibrating with the impact of his complete, unmitigated surrender to the facts. The echo of his own voice settled into the floorboards. He exhaled, a long, audible release of air that seemed to drain the remaining tension from his shoulders. His frame, previously coiled and rigid, relaxed. He shifted his weight, his boots scraping against the wood, and walked toward the center of the room. He did not look for a place to hide. He turned in a slow circle, observing the dim corners and the dust motes dancing in the sliver of light. He acknowledged the failure as a part of his own physical composition, not an external force to be fought, but a recurring rhythm of his own design. He stopped pacing and stood still. He pressed his palms together, feeling the heat of his own skin, grounding himself in the present. This was the reality of his existence. Not the legend, not the public image, but the man standing in the quiet, struggling with the same basic gravity as anyone else. His breathing slowed to a steady, rhythmic pace. The room felt different now, stripped of the pressure to perform. He looked at his hands, turning them over, inspecting the calluses and the lines of his palms. He had stopped running from the truth of his own limitations. In this moment of stillness, the air felt clearer, the shadows less menacing, as he fully occupied the space of his own humanity. He moved away from the center of the room, his footsteps muffled by the worn rug. He reached the door and gripped the cold metal of the handle. Before turning it, he stopped. He did not pull the door open. Instead, he pivoted back toward the wooden table. The glass sat there, catching the faint light from the window. It was half full, the liquid still, undisturbed by the weight of his confession. He watched the surface of the drink, the way it reflected the dim geometry of the ceiling. It was a tangible marker of the battle that had not ended. He tightened his grip on the doorknob, his knuckles turning white, but he did not move to reach for the glass. He simply stood there, observing it. The silence in the room returned, no longer heavy with the need for words, but thick with the presence of the object itself. He studied the rim of the glass, the faint condensation on its side, and the way it stood in the center of the table like a silent witness to his own choices. It was a testament that he could not ignore or walk away from. He fixed the image in his mind, a final, unblinking confrontation with the reality of his own persistence, before he turned his attention back to the threshold of the hallway. He rotated the brass knob. The latch clicked, a sharp mechanical snap that broke the silence. He pushed the door outward, the wood groaning slightly against the frame. As he stepped over the threshold, his body blocked the light from the corridor for a fraction of a second, casting a long, distorted shadow that stretched back into the room he was leaving. He did not look back at the table. He did not glance at the glass. He moved forward, his boots hitting the polished floorboards of the hallway with a rhythmic, steady cadence. The corridor light was harsh, unfiltered, and unforgiving, washing out the remnants of the dim room behind him. He walked into the glare, his shoulders squared, his gaze fixed on the path ahead. Every step was a rejection of the shadows he had occupied for so long. He reached the end of the hall, the boundary of his old life finally falling away. He did not slow down. He stepped into the full brightness, his silhouette sharpening against the wall, moving with the weight of a man who had traded the comfort of a lie for the abrasive, necessary grit of the truth. He kept walking until he was gone,